All right, so thank you for having me today. The goal of my presentation is to bring more of the clinical research of AI and what you need to be maybe teaching to students as these tools or decision-making support tools and AI-driven software as a medical device may become more of a reality in the future of PT practice. My research background, for those who don't know, is actually in the industry right now with Medtronic, where I kind of lead the digital health integration into our devices and how they can support decision making within a neurology space, but it's still very applicable to what PTs do day to day. Digital health, AI, and machine learning, they're going to become a clinical reality 5, 10 years down the line. It's just a matter of how they will be integrated. So while we teach students today, this is fundamental information that they will need to know into the future. Now, while and I'm sure the majority of you will share, we won't be necessarily replaced. These tools will help augment what we do in the clinic. And we've spoken a lot today about how AI can improve how you optimize your day-to-day as a teacher, as a person with chatbots. But this is taking it more onto the machine learning, onto the clinical research and translation side of things, and what you should teach from a foundational perspective and how you can potentially integrate it into your curriculums. And the good thing is this is probably the best opportunity you have to make statistics exciting for your students. So, AI has a lot of promises with it, right? You have this expectation that you have this complicated data, this complicated scenario, and I hear this all the time in my day-to-day. Well, we'll just wait for AI to take care of this, right? But in reality, what you get may not necessarily meet your expectations. And this is particularly pertinent to what we do as physical therapists, where we deal with very complex patient scenarios. We span a whole gamut of different intervention sets, different patient populations, different time points in a patient's journey, right? And when we look to evidence, as we try to embrace evidence-based practice to a greater extent than I hope that what we are doing right now, you really need to become a great avid and consumer and curious consumer of clinical evidence. Now, as the proliferation of artificial intelligence and machine learning based research comes out, we need to start to teach PTs of how to be consumers of that and bring it into their clinical practice. Additionally, as software as a medical device comes into the clinic, you need to be kind of an optimistic skeptic of what the software and this machine learning algorithms can do. So as clinicians, we're trained to take in data, process it to come up with a diagnosis or a prognosis, develop interventions, assess outcomes, and then do this on this perpetual cycle. And within PT's curriculum and practice, you start to hone down and become proficient in a specific realm of expertise to identify patterns, right, in your data that you're collecting as a clinician, or as you're seeing as outcomes. And you do that, and that's how you gain that skill, right? That's how we purport ourselves as skill-based interventionists, right? And as a neuroscientist in background, this is how I view it, where you're collecting all of this kind of complex information and you're integrating it over time to create that decision making that you're doing within the clinic each day. And it's effectively pattern recognition, where you're taking input data, assigning weights to the importance of that, and then generating some sort of outcome that you're continually assessing, right? Now, this is really no different than how a lot of AI algorithms operate. And then you have a generic, neural net example here, where on the left you have some sort of input data, a hidden layer of different nodes, and an output, right? And over time, through that exposure and experience, you assign different weightings of importance, right, to get into your outcome in a more optimized manner, in a more efficient manner. So the question is, why should we start to import an increased weight of artificial intelligence and machine learning into curriculums today. Now, it's not going to go away in my mind. The ability for us to improve decision making within the clinic with digital health technology across the whole spectrum of artificial intelligence to machine learning will continue on as individuals start to adopt this in a greater extent in their research, and then the downfall from research into the clinical setting. So it's advantageous on us right now to start to teach our students these concepts as we have just, as a lot of our other statistic courses that we do in our evidence-based practice classes, perhaps, right? Now, I think it's important to keep in mind as you're thinking about how to integrate this into your curriculums of the spectrum of decision-making support that clinicians can have with digital health technology. And this is a nice example that I like to present by Bitterman et al., where, from a pure level 1 perspective, where it's still the clinician making the decision, and it's maybe just AI providing some visualizations of data. But at the end of the day, you're still making that decision. All the way to the end of the spectrum where you're fully automating some sort of task to a machine learning algorithm in the clinic, right? In my small group, we had a discussion of maybe here's my patient, my diagnosis, my top 5 problems. Give me 3 exercises for a home exercise program. And the AI or machine learning system would spit those out. That would be an example of maybe a fully automated system. But keep in mind the spectrum of a potential reality of what clinical practice may look like 5, 10, 15 years down the line. Now, because of this, we need to train individuals to understand what those systems are using for their input data, how maybe that model is trained, and then become a consumer of what is this telling me? Do I trust it? In order to weight their decision-making based off of that. Is it augmenting, or is it making the decision for them? Or are they using it as an input in their own decision-making? So from a core competencies perspective of what you should be starting to shift your students towards is really fundamentals and literacy of machine learning and artificial intelligence. And for the most part, when I refer to AI, I'm specifically looking at the subsection of machine learning. From a clinical research perspective, the majority of that is in that realm. Okay, this isn't AI with LLMs, some of the earlier discussions, really more on the machine learning focus. From there, translating that information into how it can support clinical decision making, and then understanding some of the ethics and biases that may underlie those models for their generalizability for the patient that's in front of them, right? Research is an N of 10, 20,000 patients, but at the end of the day, we're dealing with one patient. So from a fundamentals and literacy perspective, some of the foundational stuff you need to be integrating is the types of models that are out there that are commonly used, how those models are trained, and then how they're evaluated. It can be very high level from a general categorical perspective, but they should be somewhat aware of what these are doing. Then, just like any sort of critical appraisal class or approach that you might do in an evidence-based practice course, you need to understand where they're sourcing this data from, the quality perhaps, the model appropriateness for their research question, how they're training, validating, and testing those models, and then be able to judge for themselves the performance of them. If they're going to use it to make some sort of clinical decision, they should know what is good, what is bad. And then this is where I think it gets really interesting for students, is taking that and then applying it to the clinic, whether they're assessing the clinical relevance of that. Is it generalizable to their patients that they're working with at the end of the day? And is it usable evidence for them? Now, in the future, when these tools become a reality for us in the clinic, they will have to undergo some sort of regulatory requirement. right? I work in a very highly regulated industry. And if these tools are going to start to come out with claims of what they're doing, they need to understand what sort of that operating network is. Now, MDs and DOs know this very well because they have to deal with meds and the medical devices, but PTs need to become more familiar with this in my mind. So from an overarching perspective of the types of models that are out there that students should be familiar with, it's really boils down to the three categories. And in terms of existing research today, really just maybe one. And that's supervised learning models, where you're working with labeled data. So it already has some sort of outcome that you're trying to either predict or define from a, maybe a diagnostic classification. Um, the good news is you probably already teach one of these in regression models. Regression is really machine learning. It's just, bad branding to be called regression. But in terms of what you need to teach then underneath it, it's just essentially, how are they trained and tested, and then some of the outcome parameters. Then we move on to unsupervised learning. This is really pattern recognition, looking for clustering of different patterns of groups based off of different characteristics that you're inputting. And then the final one, and this is rather uncommon, but I felt it obliged to mention it, is reinforcement learning, where it's really decision optimization and then adaptive learning. And by, obviously, if you're familiar with any sort of motor control theories of reward-based learning or basal ganglion learning, something where you're essentially enticing or making the outcome more advantageous with a reward-based learning set. So one of the things to really be a healthy skeptic on is looking at how the models are trained. So this includes taking in what data are they using? How are they splitting it out? So when machine learning models are trained, they have about 70% of that data going to training the model. They'll then leave a small piece out for validation and then testing. Okay, and this is really important to understand. Because it goes into the outcome of what you're going to be using into the clinic. All right. Now, ideally, you're having this data trained on patients that are representative of the research question they're going after. The outcomes are sufficient for the question that they're targeting, and that when they test it on unseen data, they get comparable outcomes, so they're avoiding overfitting. And then the most ideal scenario is they're using it prospectively for some sort of question as well. Now, the second piece of this to understand and convey to students is the importance of the amount of data that they're using in terms of the weight of the clinical decision that they may be targeting. So as a general guiding principle, the more data you have, the higher your performance will be. Now, eventually you'll reach some zenith and plateau of that performance over time. And for very complicated questions where they're using these deep learning or neural network type based questions where these models are very complex and they require a mass amount of data, they tend to have a more linear relationship between that amount of data that's going in and their overall performance. So when you're introducing these concepts in terms of a statistical course, it's important to understand that the weighting that your students are going to put on that evidence at the end of the day should be related to the amount of data that's going into the training of these data sets. Now, the good news is when you're looking at a evaluation of the model performance, a lot of the statistics are very similar to what we're already used to as evidence consumers for evidence-based practice. So for a classification model for diagnostics or risk prediction, they'll commonly report sensitivity, specificity, you have your false and positive rates, false discovery rates. but they'll tend to add, accuracy, F1 scores, or feature importance, where they start to get at what input data is most important for driving this predictive output. Again, it's similar to what you might see in regression as well. But when they're consuming this data, particularly in a multimodal setting in which PTs live, where you're not making a decision based solely off one piece of information, being aware of some of these measures is going to be salient for students as they're trying to bring this evidence into their clinical practice. Now, I also have for our continuous outcome measures, some of the common model performance metrics that you might see, such as mean, absolute, or squared error, R2, or squared scores. So again, you probably already teach a lot of this stuff. You're just changing the methods section of how you're getting to there just a little bit differently. Now, for those who like to integrate, critical appraisal of clinical evidence tools, there are a number out there and some standard reporting guidelines that are now becoming more AI specific. So there's, Consort AI, Tripod AI, or Decide AI. Now, most of these are very similar to their non-AI based equivalents, but they are just adding how that data was acquired, how the output was used, perhaps in their clinical decision making, and that's important context to consider there. And then what their inclusion and exclusion criteria for their patient population, that's important for us as clinicians when we're trying to say, is there included patient similar to what my patient in front of me is? But then they also have that for the data that's going into it and training it too. So that's important to consider in review. But then how does the output and their model performance relate ultimately to the outcome that they're trying to predict, and ensuring that they have an appropriate methodology. So those are some easy assessment tools that are available. So I included this as a guidance to students of how they should potentially view models that they will be potentially using in the clinic in the future, and to get them familiar with the regulatory environments of what they're going to be using on patients, as it could affect their outcomes and safety. So when the company brings a model to market, they likely have some sort of model training and validation process to ultimately get to a deployed model, which they'll be using in that clinic. And they should be healthy reviewers of how they got to where they are in the clinic today. But then there's also a lot of these companies will have iterative updates, right? It's an ever-changing life cycle of how this data is changing over time. So having an understanding of how the data and tools are coming to market is going to be advantageous to be aware of for these individuals. So from a clinical case perspective, we have this EBP model of, you develop a research question, you collect this evidence, you integrate it into your patient care, and then you kind of reflect upon those outcomes in this continuous cycle. And you're really just adding an AI piece onto it. So the question could, you give them a case example, you say, find some AI-based evidence off of this, and then they're continually, generating that feedback loop of how they're leveraging it. And it could be very simple to integrate today. You might already have classes and curricula which are equally aligned with this. Now, to finish on a few pitfalls, if you will, of how clinicians may use the type of data in their clinical practice and how you might teach it. I'll start with how clinicians apply this research into their practice. One is essentially blind trust in AI. And again, remember that scale of how you're going to use it. Are you going to use it to make the decision for you, or are you going to use it to help and augment your decision? In addition to that, you need to understand the foundational information of these models, as and it will pretty much help you inform how you're going to use that information in the clinic. And I've listed a couple others here, but I'll continue on to maybe the more pertinent one of how you're going to teach it to your students. And one is that it's easy to potentially think you're overcomplicating it, but it can be very summative. It can be very high level. It can be at the level of your normal statistics that you teach today, right? But you don't want to ignore the ability to take this information and really just treat it as you would any other sort of piece of clinical evidence into a hands-on learning experience to put it to home, right? So I'll wrap with saying that AI, and more notably for my conversation here, is machine learning is a tool to enhance and not replace clinical decision making, and that we need to train students to know how the models are trained and developed, and then be, optimistic skeptics of that data for them to bring it into the clinic, as it will become some of the reality in the future. Now, I made this figure, and I'm just noting here that the example with the clinician making all the decision is the ape. That's probably not the best example, but as you go all the way up to AI, but eventually we're going to get to this part where we'll have these systems in our clinical practice at some point, and we need to start teaching students the fundamental information they need to know to treat patients safely in order to ensure holistic outcomes. And with that, I'll just say thank you. If you have any continued interest in this topic, I did publish a paper in PTJ that kind of summarizes a lot of this and some of the future potential realities of it. So thank you all for your time. Looking forward to hearing your questions.
Thank you so much, Jason. You've given us, Nathan, you've given us so much to think about. And I did look at your article. Now I want to go back again and read it again. So it's my pleasure to have had you. And now I'd like to introduce our next speaker, who is CJ Morrow. And I am going to get some help. There we go. All right, all right, CJ, thank you very much for being here, and take it away.
I'm so excited to be here. So the premise of what I'm going to talk about right now is kind of a higher theoretical type of thing, and thinking about how PTs can be day one ready in terms of mastering AI. So real quick, let me get my computer working. I'm CJ. I'm a clinical quality senior analyst at Hinge Health. Hinge Health is a digital musculoskeletal solutions clinic. We are a benefit to employers. I work with AI every day. I also co-chair the Frontiers in Rehabilitation Science and Technology member engagement group with the APTA. And I have both in clinic, in real life type of PT experience, but also virtual PT experience. I'm no longer a practicing PT, but I have a lot of exposures to what our PTs are doing as well. I have, just disclosures. All my views are my own. I'm not on here on behalf of the APTA or my company, that sort of thing. So let's dive in. So like I mentioned, I use AI in some capacity every day. The PTs that work at Hinge Health are empowered with AI tools that help to personalize their approach with our patients. Some ways that I use AI is data analysis, doing statistical regression modeling, looking at tens of thousands of asynchronous messages and being able to summarize them. I do a lot of monitoring and assessment of the quality of our support. And I have every one of our workflows incorporates AI in some capacity. I also quality monitor AI systems within Hinge Health as well. And the team that I work on is ensuring that our whole service model and our service product provides excellent quality. And then case studies and simulations. So I've created training chatbots for our care team around how to, for instance, write and message asynchronous support with empathy, all of those things. And I will say I also use AI for presentations, writing refinement, policy, and procedure drafting. And this presentation, and one of the things that I would ask everyone to reflect on, I used AI heavily in this presentation. And I almost wanted to put, I use Claude Claude's name almost went on the front page with me. And so thinking about how that makes you feel about what I'm about to talk about as well. The last time I didn't use AI for a presentation, probably was 2 years ago, ironically on AI. And my security, IT security wouldn't let me use AI to do it. So I've been using it for many years. And I come to you today not as an educational expert, but as someone, again, immersed in AI transformation and PT practice. And so today I'm going to use a familiar kind of SBAR approach to report on 4 critical areas that determine whether graduates thrive or struggle in today's AI-enhanced clinic. So today's graduates need to excel in 2 worlds, essentially. So they have this technological innovations that's in this clinic, and also clinical expertise as well. So there is a level of urgency in preparing our new graduates for technological capabilities and enhanced capabilities in the clinic. So because AI has become integral to my practice, it'll be integral to your graduates' practice as well. So what will they encounter on day 1? And as a note, all the watercolor, I thought it was like, well, we're gonna have some calming watercolors to accompany some of this information. All of this is AI generated as well. So there's AI integrated into tons of systems in the clinic. Not every clinic will have these systems. Some will have none, some will have some, but from the moment they get out, maybe they get in their car, they're using Google Maps, they apply to a job, there's some level of probable AI use. And I apologize if you can hear my dog quiet throughout the whole time. So these systems and AI enhancements are already in place in our clinic, and they're only going to get more prevalent and where your graduates will work. So not only are graduates balancing, building that kind of gut clinical practice responsibility, they're integrating technology, but they're also acclimatizing to the workplace. And I want to take a pause because we're talking about tech, we're talking about clinical expertise, that, of course, my dogs, that when a new graduate, and most of my class, I was a second career PTer, most of my class didn't have a career job that they went into. So this is kind of their first profession that they're going into. And there's an organizational, there's a cultural aspect to that too. So there's this triple burden going into the PT clinic now. So you're going to own your own clinical decisions. You're going to need to master new technologies, and you're going to have to adapt to an organizational culture. And that can be really, really hard. So with all these new AI tools already in the clinic, the question then becomes, how do we prepare graduates to use them effectively? And of course, you're like, well, that's why we're here. And so the foundation really starts with understanding that any AI output is only as good as its input. And Nathan alluded to this a little bit in the previous presentation. So our first critical area is garbage in, garbage out. And I come to you from a quality background, looking at documentation, and I'm sure all your students are like, oh, this is probably my most favorite thing to do, because all the clinicians are like, I love documenting. It's so fun. But really, when we think about data and a lot of EHRs, EHR is going to transform those clinical notes into analyzable data that then is being used by AI. And then it's going to spit out, a clinical decision. So if our PTs are setting themselves up with the habit and forming the habits early on to really do good documentation practices, then that AI isn't going to be as effective as it should be in the clinic, or as it can be in the clinic. And so some of the real world applications that I would use with some data, and I do have a closed system AI within my organization. So I've been able to look at patient satisfaction, not only on an individual level, but on a team level, on an organizational level? Where can we go from here? What can we work on? And some of the things with documentation is that PTs need to understand how their notes will have this downstream impact on healthcare decisions for their organization. And so the ability to interact with healthcare data extends PT's influence beyond just direct care. And so when we understand that quality documentation drives quality AI outcomes, we've tackled the technical foundation. But there's a little more subtle danger lurking beneath the surface of AI integration. And that's the risk that technology might actually erode rather than enhance clinical skills. So when we think about curriculum development, and I'm not here to say how to do it, I'm just kind of presenting my observations and what I see in PTs today. We need to design elements that help prevent de-skilling. And de-skilling is that complacency and dependency on technology, that automation bias that can happen when we have something doing something for us and we start to trust that system a little bit more and more. So we have to really be intentional to prevent de-skilling rather than just hoping graduates will naturally maintain the skills that they learn in the 3 years that they have with you, 3 or 4. So there's kind of this progression, right? We start using a tool, we'll call it AI in this case, we start using ChatGPT as a convenience, but then we start depending a little bit more on it. So we have an erosion of confidence. And then all of a sudden our skills start to atrophy. And now we're truly dependent on that tool to continue to function within our daily occupations and that sort of thing. So we want to start to build counter habits during education, and new graduates are most vulnerable to this. They just come out of the education. They don't have the experience, the practical experience. And we get that a little bit with clinical rotations, and I'll acknowledge that. But when it's your own license and it's your own practice, it's a little bit different. So there's just fewer memory anchors to counter AI suggestions. And not only that, we hear it all the time. Productivity pressures incentivize finding shortcuts. And AI is a fantastic shortcut. And not only that, but we've also talked about just the natural tech comfort coming in to education, and that can lead to an overconfidence in AI capabilities as well. So some things to think about is, and I was like brainstorming, is what happens when we don't give the right answer? So a lot of our at least I remember a lot of the multiple choice questions. What happens if there isn't a good answer in there, or the right answer isn't in there? Are we teaching that ability to question within our education? Calibration exercises. During our group, we kind of talked about, okay, well, what about just having a conversation on how we're going to use AI, how the comfort of using AI, and what kind of risks that students feel with AI too, and opening it up that way. So as we protect against de-skilling, we face another challenge. So helping new graduates maintain confidence in their clinical judgment when sophisticated AI suggests otherwise. So that there's this confidence kind of paradox that can happen. So AI could boost confidence, but it also can undermine clinical confidence too. And again, we talked about new graduates being especially vulnerable to this because they have an experience gap, because they have disagreement anxiety. It's enough to cause you indigestion. This guy thinking pretty hard. But there's also strategies that we can use to foster new PT confidence. So Nathan mentioned really teaching how AI machine learning algorithms work, teaching to the limitations, talking about the limitations, structured practice evaluation, and sometimes rejecting AI suggestions, practicing how to explain clinical reasoning that contradicts AI. And then regular feedback on appropriate levels of certainty and clinical judgment. You can ask AI, like, how confident are you? Or tell me why you thought about this. And those kind of questions are really good. Also asking our students and new PTs. So confidence comes from understanding both when to leverage AI and when to trust clinical judgment. Students need explicit practice in disagreeing with technology as an authority and an expertise. And what's really great too is that will transfer to practicing disagreeing with other things that might be expert. So I always love new graduates because they have such a wealth of didactic information that is up to date and it's relevant and it's there. It's not me trying to find it. It's I get to learn from them, but they also need to know that ways of how they can teach others. And AI and disagreeing with AI might be a transferable skill there. And then effective AI integration requires psychological safety to question automated recommendations as well. So again, graduates who view AI as a tool, not an authority, and that habit formation needs to start really early on before they get to day one. So maintaining clinical confidence sets the stage for our next focus, because ultimately, confidence must be paired with responsibility. And in an AI-enhanced practice, quality takes on a new dimensions, and our do no harm principle extends to technology use. So the bottom line is there's an unchanging professional responsibility for our PTs, whether they use technology or not. AI outputs used in practice remain the PT's legal responsibility. And assisted by AI, we've seen this in a example in the courtroom, is never defensible for clinical errors. And we have this ethical obligation of do no harm, which honestly should be do good. So that when we're always thinking about, does this enhance the care that I can deliver for this patient in front of me? Because that's a question that we continually need to ask with technology. And so thinking about building a quality mindset is around building the habits of verification, of questioning, setting boundaries, knowing when AI should assist and when human judgment should prevail alone. And then that continuous evaluation. I work often in a PDSA cycle, so plan, do, study, act, as a continuous improvement, which is really great when we think about patient treatment, right? PT comes in, I'm going to plan a treatment, I'm going to study my patient, I'm going to then act and iterate on my treatment plan. So I have 1 minute left. The ethical responsibility brings us to a practical question and thinking about how we can integrate AI into a curriculum without kind of overhauling it. And the good news is that preparing AI competent graduates doesn't require starting from scratch. So I wanted to leave y'all with kind of what would you be able to do Monday morning? And something is like, just start small. Add in one AI verification exercise, thinking about building awareness, discussing AI ethics when using tech. If you have AI in your institutions, do you have a governing board? Are you able to talk or invite them in to talk about how your approach as an institution is to AI? Because that can be really impactful. And then creating balance. Explicitly assigning and opening up the ability to use AI, but then also really requesting students honor independent clinical reasoning as well. And so I'm going to kind of leave you with closing thoughts. So there's some practical implementation strategies that we can use to create pathways to graduates who are both AI literate and clinically excellent. So as we move, I know we're going to discussion. I'm particularly interested in exploring how these approaches might create a framework for responsible AI use in expanding PT clinic roles. I'm very passionate about, we are a doctorates of physical therapy. So let's be doctors of physical therapy. And so then now we think about which competencies must directly uphold our commitment to do no harm, or even better, do good. So I'm going to have 3 questions for you, as well as the prompt. So as PTs move into expanding care roles, which AI competencies might become most crucial? When facing our do good type of commitment, which AI skills should we prioritize first? And how do we balance technical proficiency with clinical reasoning development? And I'll bring you back to the question I asked you to reflect upon, because I've talked for 22 minutes now, is this was created not with just by me, but also with AI. So by preparing graduates who understand both the potential and limitations of AI, we're not just helping them to survive in tomorrow's healthcare environment, we're positioning to lead it with technology enhancing rather than replacing their uniquely human expertise. So thank you very much, y'all.